Ypres salient, Belgium, October 1917. Private Thomas Bell arrived just after the rain. He stepped off the transport lorry with a satchel of letters, a mud-caked rifle, and the dull, hollow stare of a man who'd already seen too much of the war. His orders sent him to the 2nd Battalion, East Yorkshire Regiment, somewhere along the reserve line near Ypres. He didn't know the names of the men he'd be joining. He didn't know the name of the trench they held. And in truth, it didn't matter. Everything here had the same shape: mud, blood, and silence stretched thin by fear. But there was something different in the air. That evening, something he couldn't quite name. The trench was quiet. Too quiet. Not the peace of rest, but the hush before a scream. The wind didn't howl like it did near the Somme. It whispered, soft, like it was trying not to wake something beneath the boards. The men he passed offered few greetings. Most didn't speak at all. They just stared through him, past him eyes, like old water. Still and clouded, Sergeant Whitcomb gave him his billet, a dugout near a collapsed tunnel wall, cold and damp and lined with names carved into the timbers. Most were Hafarist. By rot, you'll take second watch, the sergeant muttered. Don't wander near the crater, and if the men ask about shadows, don't answer. They'll forget by morning. Thomas didn't ask what that meant. He knew better than to question a warning wrapped in silence. The crater lay just north of the sapline, near the tree stump they called Deadman's Tooth. The men said it had appeared after a shell fell free. Weeks ago, but hadn't exploded. The ground just caved in, swallowed itself, and now the area around it never quite felt right. The rats avoided it. The fog clung to it longer, and once or twice, men who slept too close to its edge claimed they woke somewhere else. Thomas chalked it up to nerves. Too many nights in wet socks and cold steel helmets. He'd seen men unravel for less, but later, just before dusk, as he passed a group of soldiers near the mess line, he saw it for himself. One of them, a wiry corporal with shaking hands, was lighting a cigarette, and he cast no shadow. The others did. Clear, elongated shapes across the trench wall. But this man had none. The flame of his match flickered, reflected in his eyes, but nothing moved on the boards behind him. Thomas blinked, stepped closer, still nothing. The corporal looked up, as if sensing the attention, and then, without a word, he smiled a slow, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes. He turned and walked away. Thomas watched him go, and then something strange happened. For a moment, just a second, the corporal's boots didn't leave footprints. That night, the fog rolled in early, thick, wet, heavy as wool. The trenches narrowed. In that kind of weather, sound warped. Footsteps came from places no one stood. Conversations echoed when no one spoke. Thomas stood second watch near the crater's edge, lantern in hand, and listened, not for shellfire, not for the enemy, but for something deeper. And in the fog, he saw movement, shapes thin, slow, too smooth to be rats. They glided along the duckboards like thoughts slipping through a broken mind. No sound, no breath, just presence and the crater. It hummed, not loudly, a low, pulsing rhythm, like something far below was breathing through wet stone. The air above it shimmered slightly like heat on glass, but the night was freezing. He turned to call out to the man next to him, a private whose name he hadn't yet learned, but the man was gone, not left gone. No boot prints, no gear, just a slight warmth in the space where he'd stood. And on the wall behind him, scrawled in mud, He has no shadow. Thomas stepped away from the crater, fast, nearly slipped, and that's when he noticed something else. His own shadow was moving slower than his body, just a half-second behind. But wrong, delayed. As if it were remembering to follow instead of naturally obeying. He didn't sleep that night, at dawn. The men were all there again, present, silent, tired. The corporal with no shadows stood among them, face expressionless. The others didn't notice, didn't speak to him. Thomas asked the sergeant about him, who, Whitcomb said. The corporal, last night, no shadow. The sergeant squinted at him. There's no corporal assigned to this sector. You must dreamt him. Thomas looked past the sergeant, to the man, standing, watching, smiling, and still no shadow. Ypres, 1917, fog watch. Second line, the mist lingered longer the next night. It poured into the trench-like breath from a dying god, rolling over duckboards and pooling in boots, thick enough that you could barely see your own hands unless you held them close. The fog here didn't just obscure, it listened. You could feel it pressing in, brushing against your skin like fingers beneath ice. Thomas Bell stood watch again, back near the crater, though he hadn't volunteered. His name had simply appeared on the rotation sheet. No one remembered writing it. The sergeant just nodded and told him, the fog's different tonight. Stay sharp. Don't follow voices. Voices, that word stayed with him all evening. He hadn't heard any, not exactly. But the trench had started to speak in other ways. Boots on boards where no one walked. Canteens clinking from places long abandoned. A faint rhythm tapping on the timber walls, like knuckles knocking from inside. He hadn't told the others yet that their shadows were behaving strangely. Not all the time, but enough. He'd seen one soldier, Davis, lean against a sandbag wall, arms crossed, smoking. But his shadow had no arms, just a slumped silhouette with its head tilted toward the ground. Another man, Harris, had crouched to clean his rifle. His shadow just stood, still, upright. Watching him, Thomas hadn't dared to speak of it, because once you noticed, it never stopped. When you stared too long at a man's shadow in the fog, it started to feel like it was staring back, as if it were more real than the man casting it. And sometimes the shadows didn't return when their men walked away. They just stayed behind, lingering that night. During second watch, Thomas stood in the crater path alone. The fog had thickened. Again, he couldn't see past the next bend in the trench. He lit his lamp oil-fed, flickering, and tried to focus on the mud at his feet. Then he heard it, a whisper, very soft, very near, but not in front of him, not behind him, inside him. It said his name, not like a stranger, not like a ghost, like someone he knew, someone who had been buried. Thomas. He spun around. Nothing but fog, no echo, no retreating footsteps, just the hiss of the lantern and his own breath, now sharp, uneven. He stepped away from the crater, but his legs were shaking. That's when he realized there were footprints, his own, leading backward from the edge of the crater, as if he'd already been there, as if he was just returning. He followed the trail to the dugout, trying not to look at the walls too closely. The carvings were deeper now, scratches, spirals, names he didn't know, and something else, a message, etched faintly where the light just caught it. The man with no shadow walks first. He didn't sleep. When the morning came, he tried to talk to Harris and Davies, the ones with the strange shadows. He found them both playing cards in a sandbagged corner near the latrines. They looked fine, But when he approached, they stopped playing. Not like they were surprised, more like they'd been waiting for him, and they both smiled. That same smile the corporal gave him, wide, polite, empty. Then Harris said, "Funny thing, I had a dream about you." Thomas didn't answer. Davies said, "You were digging, not for the enemy, for something else." He stood to leave, but Harris whispered, "You've started hearing it, haven't you, in the fog?" Thomas froze. Davies leaned forward. "Don't listen too closely. That's how it gets in." He didn't ask what it was, because part of him already knew. That night, he found something in his coat pocket, a scrap of paper, damp with sweat or mist, written in pencil, his own handwriting. But he had no memory of writing it, just 3 words, "Bury." "Your shadow." He dropped it, burned it. But the words stayed with him, and later, while washing mud from his hands, he noticed something in the water. His reflection blinked after he did, only half a second late, but wrong. Ypres, front line, 1917. The crater sector by the end of the week. Thomas no longer trusted his reflection. He saw it now only in puddles, those shallow, warm mirrors that stretched between duckboards, and each time it seemed slower, less certain. Once he bent down to wash his face, and the water rippled with movement before he'd even touched it. His reflection turned its head before he did, not the other way around. He told no one. What could he say? That his shadow sometimes moved without him. That he found muddy boot prints beside his bedroll each morning that didn't match his size. That he woke up whispering words in a voice that wasn't his. The others had already begun to change. Davies spoke in his sleep now. Not in English, not in French or German, just syllables. Slow and rhythmic. The kind of sound that felt older than language. Harris, once a loudmouth joker, now sat in silence for hours, head tilted like he was listening to music no one else could hear. And every time Thomas looked at them, he was less certain they were still men. Their faces were pale, expressionless, but their eyes moved too quickly, flicked between things that weren't there, watched shadows that shouldn't have been cast. And the corporal, the one no one else claimed to see, he appeared again, just after dusk, standing at the far end of the trench, half obscured by mist, lantern light bending away from him. His uniform was the same, his face the same, that same clean, bloodless smile. But now he was barefoot. Thomas stared. The man didn't move, didn't blink, but the fog behind him shivered, like it was breathing with him. Thomas turned to call for the sergeant. When he looked back, the corporal was gone. But in his place, something lay on the ground. A helmet, British issue inside it, curled like a leaf. A single scrap of cloth, red, white, blue. The Union Jack, faded and torn, folded into the shape of a spiral. He didn't pick it up. He didn't need to, because now the humming had begun. It was in the walls, in the duckboards, in the damp beams above the dugouts, in his teeth, low, constant, like something thinking behind the wood. And the trench had changed. He knew it like you know your name. He walked the loop one evening, just to prove it to himself, marked the boards with chalk, counted his steps, noted landmarks, the latrine trench, the broken ladder, the rusted field stove, by his measure. The trench should have looped back to the cum station in 4 minutes. It took 7, and when he arrived, the ladder was gone, the stove was twisted, bent in ways metal doesn't bend, and the air smelled not of powder or waste but of dust, ancient dust, like a grave unearthed too soon. He turned back, walked quickly, and heard footsteps. Behind him, he stopped. They didn't. They stopped a second later. He turned. No one, just the trench, the boards, the fog. But now his own shadow was gone. He looked down, lantern in hand, heart stuttering like a broken engine. Nothing, no shape, no silhouette, just dirt. Then, slowly, like a photograph developing in reverse, a shape appeared on the wall beside him, a shadow, but not standing. It was kneeling, head bowed, mouth open. Thomas stepped back. The shadow stayed. He ran, didn't stop until he reached the dugout, buried himself in the corner, clutched his rifle like it could make him human again. He sat there for hours until finally, in the stillness before dawn, something spoke from the back of the dugout. Not aloud, inside, a voice without lips, without tongue. It said, "We are what remains when memory dies. We were cast out of light. You gave us names, and now we wear them." He covered his ears, but it kept speaking, and outside, in the grey fog, he heard the sound of boots marching, many boots. Not toward the front, away from it, and no voices, because the hollow men do not speak, they only follow. Ypres salient, near the crater mouth. October 1917. Thomas didn't remember choosing to go back to the crater. He only knew that one morning, just after a fog-heavy sunrise, he woke with his boots already on and his coat soaked to the waist. Mud clung to his sleeves. His fingers bled in the nail beds, and on the floor beside his bunk, drawn carefully in charcoal on torn rations, paper was the spiral. This time, it was not folded. It was open. It called to him, not like a voice, but like a memory you didn't know you had. It didn't say, "Come here." It said, "You were already here. You just forgot the way." He stepped into the trench without speaking to the others. He couldn't. Their eyes followed him, those strange, empty eyes, their shadows now dragging behind them like anchors. Even Harris no longer blinked. The corporal was waiting at the crater's edge, standing in profile, face lifted toward the white sky, hands clasped behind his back like a man at church. His coat flapped gently in the breeze, though the air was still. Thomas opened his mouth. The man turned, and for the first time, he spoke. His voice was dry, thin, like breath escaping from cracked earth. "You think this place is fighting a war," he said. "It isn't. It's feeding." Thomas stepped back. The corporal took a slow step forward. "This land was a wound long before your shells found it, long before your maps gave it a name. You just dug deep enough to let it breathe again." Thomas stared down into the crater. It was deeper now. Too deep, a spiral pit, carved in uneven layers, not by man, not even by machine. Each ring seemed to ripple inward, like something had been burrowing out at the bottom. He could not see the floor, only shadow. "Breathing, you call it fog," the corporal whispered. "But it isn't weather. It's memory turned against itself. The more you forget, the more it remembers." And then he was gone, just like that. No step, no motion, just absence. The fog thickened, the spiral pulsed. Thomas fell. He didn't remember falling, but suddenly, he was at the bottom. Not broken, not bruised, but different. The ground was warm, not with heat, but with presence, like standing on a slumbering beast. The walls around him pulsed faintly. Each breath of the spiral exhaled 1,000 voices, all speaking him, his name, his fears, his mother's lullaby, his brother's laughter, all. folded and repeated like a prayer, with no God left to hear it. He turned and saw the others. They were kneeling, 20 of them, maybe more, all in uniform, all facing inward, not praying, not weeping, just silent. And behind each man cast against the far wall was a shadow that didn't belong to them. Some had too many arms. Some had no head. Some pulsed. Some moved when the man did not. And in the center of the circle lay a body, not a corpse. A version of him, same face, same boots, same bleeding thumb from yesterday's bayonet slip, only asleep or waiting. Thomas stepped closer. The soldiers didn't stop him. They didn't move. When he looked down at the body, he felt something shift inside his chest. Not pain, not fear. Recognition. The sleeping Thomas opened its eyes and whispered, "We are what is left when you are forgotten." Suddenly, all the shadows in the chamber turned toward him and smiled. Beneath the Ypres crater, October 1917. Thomas tried to scream, but the breath wouldn't come. It hung in his throat like mud thick, wet and waiting. Before him, his other self lay still, eyes half-lidded, lips parted in a half-whisper of a word not meant for daylight. The kneeling soldiers remained motionless. They did not speak, but their shadows twitched like parasites testing the air. One of the shadows slowly peeled itself from its host, stretching upward like smoke, turning into form, until it stood behind the man like a second spine, limbs long, unbent, trembling with anticipation. Thomas stepped back, and then the body on the ground, his body began to rise. Not in a natural way. It did not bend or flinch. It simply lifted, straight-backed, as if unseen hands had pulled it upright from the inside. Its head turned not toward Thomas, but toward the shadows. It smiled. The voice, when it came, echoed from no mouth. It came from the stone, from the crater walls, from inside his own skull. "You have come far to remember." Thomas tried to run, but the spiral held him. The ground moved with his feet, pulling him not away, but deeper. The walls pulsed again, and a light dim grey, like memory itself, glowed from somewhere unseen. On every surface, spirals emerged, spirals within spirals, each one carved in ash or rot, or something older than writing. And still the soldiers knelt, their mouths opened in unison, and from their throats poured shadows. They flowed from there, bodies like thick smoke, taking shape in the spiral's breath. The shapes did not resemble men not anymore. They were impressions of identity, grief given muscle, loss given movement. The air around Thomas grew heavy, and the shadow that had followed him, the one that had slowed behind his footsteps, whispered. From puddles, refused to match his movements, stepped forward. It left him and stood, a perfect imitation of his shape, his size, his stance, but without eyes, without a face, just the suggestion of Thomas Bell, and it spoke. "You do not cast a shadow," it said, "because you no longer belong to the light." Thomas reached for his rifle. His hands shook. He aimed at point-blank Cat, the thing that didn't move. He fired. The sound echoed into nothing. No recoil, no pain. The bullet passed through. The shadow stepped closer. "This was never your war," it whispered. "It was ours. And we wore your names like uniforms." Behind him, the soldiers began to rise. Their movements were disjointed, boneless, puppets cut free from strings. The shadows behind them now stood in front of them, and Thomas understood. These men had not been taken. They had willingly traded places, given up themselves, their memories, their bodies, because forgetting was easier than remembering what they had seen. "You don't have to fight," said the shadow. "You only have to forget." Thomas stumbled back, his breath ragged. The spiral below began to pulse harder, faster. The ground cracked small tremors at first, then deeper ones. He could feel it. The thing that slept below was waking, and it needed a vessel. One more shadow, one more name. "Step into me," the shadow said. "You are already hollow. Let me carry the rest." Thomas looked into its face. There was nothing, but somehow, in the darkness, he saw himself, not the man he was now, the boy, before the war, before the uniform, before the forgetting. He screamed, and threw himself into the spiral, not into the shadow, not into the soldiers, into the pit itself. The stone swallowed him. The world shattered. He woke in the trench. Alone, no fog, no crater, just dawn. The others were gone. No footsteps, no gear, no blood, no shadows, only him. And when he stood, his shadow followed, but not quite right. It walked half a step ahead of him now, leading. Somewhere near Ypres, or perhaps not. Thomas no longer knew what day it was. Time had bled away, quietly, like smoke from a dying lantern. At first, he thought it was exhaustion, delirium, maybe. But then he noticed the sun no longer followed its arc. Sometimes it rose and never set. Other times, night lasted 3 sleeps long. The moon stuck above the trench like a nail hammered into the sky. And the trench had changed. It was longer now, wider. It twisted where it hadn't before, turned left into places that should have been the front, but instead led downward, deeper into soil that pulsed with heat. The duckboards were no longer made of timber, but of bone, not fresh bone, not clean bone, ancient, curved, and fossil-heavy. He tried not to look down anymore. He tried not to listen, because the trench spoke, not in language, in memory. He passed old dugouts that had collapsed weeks ago, now rebuilt, freshly reinforced, flickering with candlelight, even though no one lit them. He saw men from his unit, men long dead, standing in clusters backs to him, murmuring, never turning. Once he called out to Sergeant Whitcomb. The man turned, but he had no face, just skin, stretched smooth across a skull that moved too slowly. It smiled anyway. "We're past the map now," the thing said, "where names no longer anchor us." Thomas fled, again. But the trench looped. He passed the same destroyed field telephone 3 times, watched the same crow pick at the same half-buried foot, heard the same shell fall in the distance, but never strike. Nothing moved forward anymore. It only repeated, but not perfectly. Each loop, the trench grew closer to something, deeper into the spiral. The walls became damper, veined with mold that pulsed like arteries. The air grew thicker, not with mist, but with presence. One evening, it was evening, Thomas found a mirror, not whole, just a fragment, buried in a collapsed ammo crate. He looked in, and his reflection stared back too long. It blinked before he did, and smiled when he did not. Its mouth moved, but no sound came, so he leaned closer, and he heard it. Just one word: switch. He hurled the glass into the wall. It shattered, but made no sound. The next day, or the next loop, he found the corporal again, sitting now on a mound of sandbags that hadn't existed before, barefoot, eyes closed, hands bloody, and in his lap a pile of discarded shadows, thin, tattered things, like rags soaked in ink, folded carefully, like clothes taken off after a long day's march. We were never men, the corporal said, eyes still closed. We were stories, worn too long, told too loud. Thomas asked him what had happened to the others. He opened his eyes, black, pupilless, reflecting nothing. They stepped backward and remembered forward. And then he offered Thomas a place beside him, offered him a shadow, not his own, offered to make him forget. Thomas refused. But even as he turned to walk away, he realized his own shadow wasn't behind him anymore. It walked ahead, choosing the path, leading, and the spiral was everywhere now, carved into walls, scratched into helmets, growing naturally into the grain of the trench boards like moss. The war had receded. The guns still roared in the far distance, but they meant nothing. This was no longer about borders or empires. This was a burial ground of identity, and it was almost full. Ypres sector, or what's left of it. November 1917, Thomas Bell awoke to silence, not peace absence. The trench was gone. He lay on damp grass, open sky above him, the smell of burned cordite and fresh frost in the air. There were no bodies, no boots, no mud-slicked up, only stillness, and the faint sound of wind threading through shattered trees. It was over, or perhaps it had reset. He sat up slowly, unsure what he was meant to feel. The aches in his bones remained, but his uniform was dry, clean even. His hands were bandaged, though he remembered no injury. A journal sat near his hip, his own, but untouched. Blank pages, no entries, no drawings, just one message, written neatly on the first page. To remain whole, you must forget. But Thomas remembered everything. He remembered the crater, the spiral, the men who no longer cast shadows, the way the trench had bent reality like wire until time itself frayed at the edges. He remembered himself, and that, he now realized, was the problem. A figure stood on the ridge above, backlit by morning light, tall, still the corporal, or something. Wearing the corporal's form, no shadow. Just like before, Thomas didn't call out. He knew better now. He simply stood, waited. The figure raised one hand slowly, palm open, and then pointed to the east, where the trench had once been, where the spiral had burrowed, where something beneath the war still breathed. Thomas turned his head, and there it was, a new crater, smaller, shallower, fresh, still, steaming, still waiting. He walked through the woods, through low fog, through silence so deep it scraped at the inside of his ears. When he reached the edge, he saw a small bundle in the dirt, a coat, folded neatly, his coat, and beside it, his shadow, detached, lying there like a skin that had sloughed off in the night, still shaped, like him, still warm. It whispered when he touched it, no words, just feeling. Familiar, welcoming. There is no peace in remembering, it said, only wait. We are what remains when meaning leaves the body. We are not ghosts. We are the ones who stay. Thomas sat beside it, tired, so tired, for hours or days he waited until the guns started again. Somewhere far away, the war, still echoing, still circling. He rose, took the coat, took the shadow, and walked east, where no maps could follow. Decades later, a farmer uncovered an old trench near Ypres. Inside, no bones, no helmets, no rifles, just one wooden wall, still upright, and scratched into it, as if by fingernails. The hollow men walk first. Beneath it, drawn in soot, a single spiral, still faintly pulsing, still alive, still waiting.